you come across as somebody who one can only describe as a real humanitarian?
My Arab identity was erased. Arabic was really looked down upon as a primitive language and the language of the enemy. And settler colonialism didn't begin in 1967. It was a continuation of process. My army, the army I knew, became the brutal police force of a brutal colonial power.
The mainstream media has been justifying genocide in Gaza. Islamophobia and censorship are the norm. We're changing that. Our journalism has reached over 300 million impressions on social media since October the 7th. On TV, our rolling news coverage has featured key figures like Hussam Zomlot, Avi Shlaim, Gideon Levy, and Jeremy Corbyn. We need your support to reveal the truth and ensure our voices are heard. So donate today at support.islamchannel.tv. Thank you for joining me on the Islam Channel podcast. Now today, my guest is none other than the world-renowned British-Israeli professor, Avi Shlaim. Professor Shlaim is an Emeritus Fellow of St. Anthony's College and an Emeritus Professor of International Relations at the University of Oxford. He is one of Israel's new historians, a group of Israeli scholars who put forward critical interpretations of the history of Zionism and Israel. Professor Shlaim was born to wealthy Jewish parents in Baghdad in 1945, and like many Iraqi Jews, his family were forced to move to the newly created State of Israel in 1947. Professor Shlaim, welcome to the Islam Channel podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
No, the pleasure is all ours. I mean, Professor Shlaim, you are somebody who is world-renowned, and I think our viewers will understand when I say world-renowned, it's not a title to be taken lightly. You are known across the Muslim and Arab world. You're also known in Western literary circles and also in academia for the work that you've done. But today's podcast is more about finding who is, with all respect, Avi Shlaim, when we take away the title professor. And you were very kind enough to gift me one of your books, which is a fascinating read into the life of who you describe to be an Arab Jew, a title which many will think, well, actually, does that actually exist? Is there such a thing as an Arab Jew? Three Worlds is the book that I'm talking about, and our viewers will see the title in the graphic that we'll put as I'm speaking. Tell us how your family felt as Iraqi Arabs, Arab Jews, in fact, before Israel was even thought of as an idea.
So I was born in Baghdad in 1945 to a Jewish family, and in 1950 we moved to Israel, rather reluctantly, as you suggested, because we were Iraqi Jews. We had very deep roots in the country. The Jews were in Iraq for 2.5 millennia since the Babylonian exile. We were in Iraq long before the rise of Islam, so we were not newcomers, and we were certainly not intruders. We were children of the land, and we were Arab Jews. We were Iraqis whose religion happened to be Judaism.
Yeah.
But Judaism wasn't our main identifier. We are Iraqis to all intents and purposes,
Yeah.
But our religion was Judaism. And we spoke Arabic at home. We only spoke Arabic at home. Our social customs were Arab customs. Our food was Middle Eastern food.
Yeah.
And we had many Muslim friends. as well as Christian friends. Faisal I, the first king of Iraq, who after the First World War had the job of unifying many diverse groups in Iraq into one nation, made a special effort to embrace the Jews. And my mother, who went to the Alliance Israélite Universelle in Baghdad, the school for girls, remembers when King Faisal I came to visit her school, and he was accompanied by the chief rabbi.
Wow.
So the Jews, there were Jewish communities throughout the Arab world. There were Jewish communities in Egypt, in Syria, in Lebanon, but the largest Jewish community was in Iraq. It was also the wealthiest, the most prosperous, the most successful community, and it contributed at every level to nation building.
Yes.
So we had a strong sense of belonging in Iraq. My mother used to talk a great deal about the Jewish contribution, positive Jewish contribution to all aspects of life in Iraq. And she also used to talk about the wonderful Muslim friends that we had in Baghdad.
Yes.
And one day I asked her, did we also have Zionist friends? And she looked at me as if this was a very strange question, and she said, no, Zionism is an Ashkenazi thing. It's nothing to do with us.
An Ashkenazi would be?
A Jew from Europe.
Okay.
As opposed to a Sephardi Jew that is a Jew from the Middle East or North Africa.
Okay. So in terms, let's stay with Iraq and the community, the Jewish community there. You say they were integrated. The cultures and mores, I suppose, were Arab in all intents and purposes. Perhaps the dress and the lifestyle. Would you say then your links to the Ashkenazi, the European Jew, were more in terms of being co-religionists as opposed to anything else in terms of how you viewed the world and your place in the world?
Yes, I would say that, most definitely, because we lived in Iraq, we spoke Arabic, linguistically and culturally we had much more in common with other Iraqis, whether Muslims or Christian, than we had with our co-religionists from Europe. We didn't know very much about their lives in Europe or their cultures. So yes, I would say culturally we were Arabs first and foremost, and Judaism was second.
Many people listen to this will probably not know a world where there are large numbers of Jews living in Arab and Muslim countries. But I suppose this was the norm prior to 1947, prior to World War II, in fact, where large numbers of Jews lived in Muslim countries as part of that society. Is that something which was a norm for a lot? You mentioned Jews were in Iraq before the advent of Islam for 2 millennia, and you cite the Babylonian exile, which is a very, very important period in history for Jews. So my question, I suppose, is the integration, where you say it was very integrated, that seems to be something far off, whereas is it as far off and as I suppose more of an ideal now than it actually was back in those days?
My memoirs have excited a lot of interest in the Arab world. And the reason for that is that any Arabs or Muslims who were born after 1948, after Israel was established, would have no idea of this reality that I describe in the book. All they know is Israel and the Palestinians, the conflict.
Yes.
They wouldn't know that once upon a time, the Middle East, the landscape was totally different. That's partly the reason that I wrote my book, and that is to recapture and reanimate a distinct Jewish civilization of the Near East, which was blown away in the 20th century by the cold winds of nationalism. Iraq was a very good example of this kind of pluralism that I'm talking about. In Iraq, there were many minorities. There were Christians, there were Chaldeans, the Catholics, there were Turkmens, there were Yazidis, and there was a long tradition of religious tolerance, of live and let live by the different minorities. So we as Jews, we didn't stand out. We were one minority among many. Iraq did not have a Jewish problem, in inverted commas. Europe had a Jewish problem. In Europe, the Jews were the other. In Iraq, the Jews were not the other. They were one minority. The Jews did not live in ghettos. This was a very pluralistic world, which was with a distinct culture, political culture, which came down from the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire seems centuries away, and it doesn't have a good reputation, but it has its saving graces. And although it was a Muslim empire, it was multi-ethnic and multilingual, and it afforded a large measure of civil and religious rights to all the minorities, and the Jews thrived under the Ottoman Empire. And the logic of the Ottoman Empire was pluralism. After the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, when the colonial powers reshaped the Middle East in their own image, nationalism was the guiding principle. So under the Ottoman Empire, the logic was pluralism, whereas in the post-World War I landscape, nationalism was a dominant force, and nationalism is a very divisive force. It's us and them, Jews and Arabs, Jews and Muslims, Israelis and Palestinians. So the political culture of the Ottoman Empire, the ecumenical culture, suited the region much better than the nationalist framework of separate nation states with borders between them and never-ending conflict. So an Algerian Berber under the Ottoman Empire could go all the way to Istanbul without a passport. It was all open. Whereas the peace settlement that was imposed on the region by the victorious powers in the First World War, Britain and France, this didn't suit the region and its culture. And I call it the post-Ottoman syndrome. And the key feature of the post-Ottoman syndrome is lack of legitimacy. The rulers were handpicked by the colonial powers. They were not legitimate. They were not elected. The political systems were
foreign.
They were foreign. They were not democracy. There was no peaceful means of bringing about political change. And the borders of the new Middle East were illegitimate because they were artificial borders cutting across live communities. This is what I call the post-Ottoman syndrome, which has produced never-ending strife and conflict and bloodshed right until today.
So you describe a bygone world now. That world has gone. For you, obviously, it's quite sad that's gone. For many, they'll have a different view on that. But let's go back to yourself. So I suppose in that atmosphere, let's say around the 1930s, the 1940s, more and more, I suppose, the space would have been closing in on Arab Jews or Iraqi Jews in your case. Tell us about how your family or your parents felt in terms of their experiences, which led to them having to, I suppose, flee Iraq into what maybe they viewed it as a homecoming, but in your book you very clearly say that for many of the elders in your community in Iraq, they viewed Israel as a faraway country of which we knew little.
In the 1930s, things in Iraq began to change, especially after the Nazi Party came to power in Germany in 1933. And then there was growing Nazi propaganda in Iraq. Part of that propaganda was anti-Semitic.
Yes.
But I'd like to emphasize that anti-Semitism is not an Arab or a Muslim phenomenon. It didn't grow in the Middle East. Anti-Semitism is a European malady. From Europe, it was transported to the Middle East. And anti-Semitism in Europe has its roots in the Middle Ages, particularly the church.
Yes.
It's the Christian church which was the generator of anti-Semitism.
Absolutely, yes.
It's interesting to note that in the 30s and 40s, when anti-Semitism was spreading in the Arab world, there was no Arabic literature which was anti-Semitic. So anti-Semitic literature had to be translated from European languages into Arabic. For example, Hitler's Mein Kampf. So things began to change for the Jews in Iraq. The environment became more hostile, and we were caught between two forces. Arab nationalism, and one manifestation of that was to reject the Jews as outsiders, as aliens. And the Istiqlal Party represented that trend in Iraq, and it called for the expulsion of the Jews and the confiscation of the property. And on the other hand, there was the Zionist movement, which had embarked by this time on the systematic takeover of Palestine, with British support, starting with the Balfour Declaration of 1917. The Zionist movement was taking over Palestine and pushing out some of the Palestinians. So there was a clash between two national movements, which affected the position of Jews in the Arab world. Things came to a head in 1948 when the State of Israel was established, and there was the first Arab-Israeli war. Zionism was an important factor here in understanding what happened, because Zionism gave the Jews, for the first time in 2 millennia, a territorial dimension.
Yes.
There was now a Jewish state nearby. So for any right-wing Arab nationalist, for any member of the Istiqlal Party, it became easier to say, to Jews, you don't belong here, you're foreigners, you're outsiders, you're not our friends, go and join your brothers. And also your brothers in Palestine are the ones who are expelling our brothers, the Palestinians.
Yes.
The 1948 war was a turning point in the history of the Jews in the region. And the Jewish community in Iraq, which had been a very constructive element in Iraqi society, was viewed increasingly as a fifth column. The Iraqi army fought in Palestine. When the war was over, all the neighboring Arab states signed armistice agreements with Israel, but the Iraqi army withdrew without signing an armistice agreement. So officially, Iraq is still at war with Israel today. And after the war, there was persecution of the Jews at the official level. There was popular hostility towards the Jews after the war.
Is that because they held them to be responsible for what was taking place in Palestine, or is it because of a more deep-seated hostility, as some would argue, particularly those from a Zionist persuasion?
I think that the main reason was official hostility towards the Jews, because the Iraqi government was a failure. It failed militarily on the battlefield in Palestine, so it was the shame of the Arab defeat. But more importantly, it was not a good government which had failed domestically. It failed its people. And therefore the Jews were picked on as a convenient scapegoat. And the Jews and the Zionists could be blamed for the Arab defeat in Palestine and for the failures of the Iraqi government. So the Iraqi government cynically exploited anti-Jewish sentiment in order to prop up its own position, and it actually started persecution at the official level. So Jewish civil servants were fired from the government. Jewish merchants had more and more restrictions placed on their activities, and there were quotas imposed on Jewish students at universities. And I think that was the main reason for the eventual exodus of the Jews from Iraq.
Which leads me on to my next point. You say in your book that when the Iraqi Jews arrived in Israel, their experience fell short of the Zionist myth. At the airport, many were sprayed with DDT pesticides to disinfect them as if they were animals. How did Iraqi Jews feel coming to somewhere where it was meant to be the homeland for the Jews, yet when they arrive, they're treated as though they were animals, in your words, or perhaps in their words, maybe that's been passed on to you, and then taken to squalid and unsanitary transit camps surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by policemen? That must have been quite a harrowing experience.
It was a traumatic experience, and on a colossal scale, because of the number of Jews involved. In 1950, when the Exodus began, there were 135,000 Jews in Iraq. By the end of 1952, there were something like 10,000 Jews only left, and they were not badly treated. And approximately 125,000 Iraqi Jews ended up in Israel.
Can I just interject there? Because there's one particular fact which we've not covered, and which you mentioned, that Baghdad, where most Iraqi Jews lived, half of Baghdad was Jewish. In some respects, it was a Jewish city. I just wanted to make that point because it's important that viewers realise how deeply embedded Jews were in Arab society.
During the First World War, the Jews constituted a third of the population of Iraq.
Wow.
And Baghdad was sometimes regarded as a Jewish city. The Jewish holidays and the Sabbath and the Jewish high holidays were respected by the rest of the population, and banks would close and businesses would close. And there was nothing unusual about that, because coexistence
was the norm.
It was the norm. But going back to the exodus of the Jews from Iraq, it wasn't a handful of Jews who left Iraq. It was the whole community, and the experience of individuals on arrival in Israel varied. But for the community as a whole, the experience was traumatic. It's like a tree being pulled out by the roots. He was a really successful, distinguished, the most ancient Jewish community in the Near East, and suddenly it's completely erased, almost without trace.
Wow.
And for those who were involved in this transition, it was very painful. I have a distant relative called Yitzhak Bar Moshe. He was a writer, and he arrived in Israel. In Israel, he never found his place. He wrote 10 books, all in Arabic, and one of them was called Al-Khuruj min al-Iraq, the departure or the exodus from Iraq. And there he says, we left Iraq as Jews, and we arrived in Israel as Iraqis.
Oh, wow.
So the Jews who arrived in Israel were not welcome with open arms, but they and their experience on arrival was very harrowing, as you put it. And there was transport arranged by Israel from Iraq to carry them, and they could only take one suitcase and 50 dinars. And when they arrived, they were penniless, and they didn't have a passport. They couldn't go to any other country, only to Israel, because they had a one-way visa to leave Iraq. And on arrival in the Promised Land, they were sprayed with DDT. So you can just imagine how painful that was, and how right away it shattered any illusions that they might have had. And from the airport they were taken to transit camps where conditions were very, very difficult. There wasn't proper housing, there were shacks, there were tents, there were very temporary buildings. The food was inadequate.
And probably foreign.
Totally foreign to them. Everything was foreign. The managers of the Ma'abarot, of the transit camps, were all European Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, who knew nothing about the background of these people, their achievements, their status in their own societies. And they thought they should be grateful for anything that is done for them, instead of complaining. So it was a very, very difficult period, and then gradually the Jews started leaving the Ma'abarot and making their own way in Israeli society. But from the beginning, they were looked down upon because they were Oriental Jews. There were Arab Jews. And the dominant ethos in the country was very Ashkenazi. So they were not accepted as equals, but regarded as rather primitive and backward.
Well, just on that point, I think it's really apt to quote you directly from the book. You say, "We were Jews from an Arab country that was still officially at war with Israel. European Jews looked down on us as socially and culturally inferior. They despised the Arabic language. I was an Iraqi boy in a land of Europeans." Now you go further on in your book and you describe your childhood growing up in Israel and how your father still kept hold of his Arabness, whereas at times when you write that when you were playing with your friends in Israel, you were somewhat embarrassed because you had an Arab an Arab culturally Arab father, and you were being brought up in this new identity, an Israeli identity, which was obviously heavily influenced by Europeans. That must have been very conflicting for you as a young boy. Tell us about that.
This is the opening scene in my memoirs, that I'm a boy about 10 years old, playing in the street with my friends. We were wearing shorts and sandals, and along comes my father, and he wears a three-piece suit with a tie.
Yes.
He looks completely foreign and alien, and he comes up to me and he starts speaking to me in Arabic. And I remember still how acutely embarrassed I was and how I went red in the face and replied in monosyllables. And I wanted to say to him, "Dad, it's okay to speak Arabic at home, but in front of my friends, I would rather you spoke to me in Hebrew." But he couldn't speak Hebrew. It's only later that I understood. I immediately felt the pain in myself, but I didn't realize how painful the experience was for my father.
Yes.
And this is the result of being uprooted from our country, ending in a different country with a different language at which neither my father nor I felt really at home.
Did that put a strain on your relationship further on as you were growing up in now Israel as an Israeli Jew? You mentioned to me when we were speaking before that people's culture was completely wiped away. You had to conform to feel you fitted into the new society. At home, what was it like with your mother and father? Were you an Arab at home and an Israeli outside of home?
To some extent, this was so. And my sisters and I went to school and we learned Hebrew very quickly, so we will speak Hebrew between ourselves. At home, my parents spoke Arabic and they spoke in Arabic to us, but we would reply in Hebrew.
Do you still know that Arabic? It must have been quite a unique dialect of Arabic.
It was a distinct Iraqi Jewish dialect, and that is the dialect that we spoke at home.
Wow. And okay, so tell us, Professor, you're now in school and you write, again, you talk about in your book how there was a systematic process at work to, as you viewed it, delegitimize your heritage and erase the cultural roots, your cultural roots. Tell us about what school and college and university, which some of our viewers who probably be going through that right now, what was it like for you as now an Israeli, perhaps stripped of your Arab identity? Maybe at home you are still keeping those cultures alive, but essentially your friends would be Israeli, perhaps mainly European. What was that process like, your education?
The dominant character the dominant factor in my period in Israeli society was a sense of inferiority.
Mm-hmm.
I carried a huge chip on my shoulder because I was an Iraqi boy.
Okay.
And I felt inferior, and I didn't feel equal to the other boys and girls in the class who were European, who were Ashkenazi Jews. I felt this sense of inferiority very acutely, and it was debilitating. And at school I didn't do it all well. I never engaged,
Okay.
and I performed very poorly, and I was cut off. I was a daydreamer, and that really held me back and impeded my development at school. But looking back, I understand better the processes at work here, because identity is not a fixed thing.
No.
Identity is very fluid, and identity isn't something that we entirely choose or shape for ourselves. Society, to a large extent, shapes our
Yes.
identity for us, and society isn't always benign. In this case, it was Ashkenazi Zionist society, which had its own norms and its own values, which were imposed on me. So my Arab identity was erased. Arabic was really looked down upon as a primitive language and the language of the enemy. My Arab culture was treated with contempt, and a new identity was imposed on me, that of a new Jew, or rather a new Israeli.
Yes.
Self-confident, strong, proud Israeli. And I never felt fully comfortable with this new identity. So there was a sort of conflicting elements in me, internal turmoil. But I never felt that I had any great talents or any great promise which were ignored by the society. I accepted the evaluation that was prevalent, that I was of an inferior breed. And at school, we were indoctrinated with Zionist ideals. And we were taught Jewish history, but only the history of the Jews in Europe.
In Europe, yeah.
We weren't taught anything about the history of the many Jews, hundreds of thousands of Jews in the Middle East. And this history, to use a phrase to borrow a phrase from the American Jewish historian Salo Baron, this history was the lachrymose version of Jewish history. The lachrymose version of Jewish history is a history of the Jews in Europe, which is hatred, discrimination, violence, bloodshed, persecution, culminating in the Holocaust. And it's debatable whether this is a true picture of European Jewish history, but it most emphatically is not true of our history.
Yes.
But I didn't know that as a boy. When I became a historian, I realized that. And when I wrote my memoirs, I asserted my right to write our own history as I experienced it and as I understand it, rather than to accept the conventional Israeli Zionist version of the Jews in the Arab world. So that's an important contribution that I hope to make in my book, to say that the Eurocentric focus of Israeli history and Zionist history doesn't really apply to us. We have a separate history that we can be proud of, and I am now proud of my Arab heritage.
You describe yourself as an Arab Jew, and as you said, you feel very proud of that. And I'll come on to that term perhaps later on in our conversation, especially in light of recent events taking place, which we will discuss as well. But I want to talk about, you then left Israel and you came to the UK. You ostensibly came to study and you made your life here. You had a family. You talk about your first girlfriend. How was it for you as somebody who's, and that's what the Three Worlds title is about, your Arabic heritage, your Jewish Israeli heritage, and then coming to the UK, and you are a British national as well. Tell us about that.
I was 15 years old. I was about to be thrown out of high school because of low grades and because I failed English outright.
But nobody would believe that, you know. But please carry on.
It is true, and English is my third language. My first language was Arabic, my second language is Hebrew, and my third language is English. And English is a very difficult language, and I learned it the hard way.
Yeah.
It was a struggle. But I went to school here for 3 years. I lived with the headmaster. It wasn't a bundle of fun, but that was a turning point for me. I focused on my studies. My family had made a sacrifice in sending me to study in England. It was a privilege, and I had to justify that sacrifice by doing well at school. So I did well at school. I got 4 A levels,
Wow.
and I got a place at Cambridge to read history. But I didn't go straight to Cambridge from school. I went back to Israel when I was 18, and I did 2 years military service. I served in the IDF, and I served loyally and proudly in the IDF because I had been subjected to indoctrination,
Sure.
which started at school and continued in the army. And when I was inducted into the Israeli army, I accepted that we were a small, peace-loving country, a democratic, liberal country surrounded by Arab predators who wanted to throw us into the sea. And we had no choice but to stand up and fight. So that was my view at the time. When the Six-Day War broke out, when the crisis broke out in May 1967, I was a first-year history student at Cambridge, and I went down to the Israeli embassy in London, and I gave my details, and I said I wanted to go back and serve in the war that we all knew was coming.
Yes.
And they took my details. The war was over in 6 days, and I never heard from them, and I never did any reserve duty. So I've stayed in England ever since. And it's only after I'd left Israel that I got over my inferiority of being an Iraqi boy.
Just go back to your family then. Tell us, I mean, you've brought us quite close to contemporary events, which people will kind of start making links to. Certainly 1967, then the crisis in 73, and then the Intifada and everything else we've seen since the 1980s. Tell us about your family, though, back in Israel. You're obviously in the UK, you're studying, you've got a place at Cambridge. How did your father and mother feel? They must have been terribly proud of you, seeing, despite all the disadvantages they probably felt, having lost all of their material wealth in Iraq, having to go, as they saw it, into exile into a foreign country. They must have thought, well, actually, here's our child now having a chance to make it into the world?
My father and my mother were an odd couple. My father was a lot older than my mother.
Yes.
And it was a forced marriage. She was a schoolgirl of 17, and he was a very wealthy bachelor who was 42 years old. And they got married, and they had a pretty happy marriage. For my mother, there was compensations in marrying such a rich man.
Of course, yeah.
Living in a palatial house with a lot of servants and a very luxurious lifestyle. She never worked. She had servants. We had nannies. And all this world collapsed very suddenly in 1950, and we ended up in Israel. My father has lost most of his wealth, and my mother, who was in her late 20s, very intelligent, very resourceful. My father was 50 years old. He couldn't speak Hebrew. He tried some business ventures that failed, and he was unemployed. And when the money ran out, my mother had to go out to work. She worked as a telephonist in the town hall in Ramat Gan, and she became the breadwinner. We lived in a small flat. We were not at all well off, and this created tensions between my parents, which eventually led to their divorce. So the move from Baghdad to Ramat Gan didn't do well for my family.
Yeah, again, another very sad moment, and you talk about that as well in your book, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to say that, because sometimes when it comes to certainly these issues, family breakups, it can be very, very sensitive. But you put it in a very delicate manner. In terms of internationally, what's going on, for example, 1967, you sign up to be an IDF volunteer or in the army in some respects. 6 days, and the war's finished. 1973, there's another crisis that's taking place, but you're obviously living your life in the UK. Your family's obviously now thousands of miles away in Israel, growing, obviously having their own experiences. When you had these crises, 67, you say very clearly you wanted to go back and defend Israel. 73, it was more of a crisis, and there was a peace treaty towards the end of the 70s. Did you then have hope that actually things will be different now? Egypt, a huge, massive contributor to Arab culture, has the largest population, certainly at that time as well. That's where the heart of the Arab world was. Now having a peace treaty with Israel, and perhaps things might be looking up for the Middle East.
The June 1967 war was a turning point in the history of the region, and it was a turning point in my personal history, because in the mid-1960s I'd served proudly in the IDF, because in my time the IDF was true to its name. It was the Israel Defense Forces. But after the June 67 war, Israel captured the Golan Heights, the West Bank, the Sinai Peninsula. It trebled its territory.
Yes.
And it became a colonial power. And my army, the army I knew, became the brutal police force of a brutal colonial power. And Israel embarked on a new phase as a settler colonial state by building illegal civilian settlements in the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights.
Was there a fundamental change in who was, or the group of people, or maybe the intelligentsia in Israel, to consciously make that decision, as you would put it, to move from being a country with a lot of enemies, but having legitimacy nonetheless, to a country which is now occupying 3 million Palestinians, which you mention in your book. I mean, I'd like to quote some of it later, right now, actually. The idea of a two-state peace settlement based on partitioning Palestine being dead, which is more your contemporary view, and the settlement enterprise, which over the past 50 years has planted more than 500,000 Jews, some of them Messianic fanatics, in the midst of 3 million strong Palestinian Arab population of the West Bank. Did you sense that shift, although you were in London, but did you sense that shift, that the founding ideals are now completely changing?
I did feel and notice this shift from the late 60s onwards, and the clearest manifestation of the shift was the building of civilian settlements on the West Bank and Gaza. The settlements are illegal, and the settlements are the main obstacle to peace. And that's because Israel became overtly a colonial power. That's when my disenchantment with Israel began. The Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty of 1979, following Anwar Sadat's visit to Jerusalem, was a very hopeful moment. But it wasn't the beginning of reconciliation between Israel and the rest of the world. It was an attempt by Israel to disengage Egypt, the most important and the most powerful Arab country, from the circle of hostile states. And it wasn't followed by an attempt at peace with the Palestinians, and indeed there was no progress towards peace with the Palestinians. So I realized that despite this first peace agreement, the core of the problem was the Palestinian issue. In essence, the Arab-Israeli conflict is a clash between two national movements, Jewish nationalism and Arab nationalism. So the Palestinian issue was always the core and the heart of the conflict, and the region can have no peace and security unless the Palestinian problem is resolved. So another point of optimism was when the Oslo Accord was signed between the PLO and Israel in 1993, and this was a historic moment. For all the limitations of the Oslo Accord, it was the first peace agreement between the two principal parties to the conflict. So I was really hopeful. I was euphoric. I thought this is the real deal. And that a Palestinian state is bound to emerge at the end of the process. There was going to be a transition period of 5 years, and I was certain, I was confident that the Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories would be gradual, controlled, but irreversible. I was wrong. The process was reversed. Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish fanatic. The Likud came back to power under Benjamin Netanyahu. This was in 1996. And Netanyahu had never concealed his hostility to the Oslo Accord, and he spent his first term in office from 1996 to 1999 in a systematic and successful attempt to dismantle the Oslo Accords. And his life's mission has been always, and still is, to prevent the emergence of a Palestinian state.
In terms of you as a British Israeli, and your relationships with perhaps Zionist Jews in this country, did this changing of your view, of your perhaps links to Zionism, which now, I mean, I've got quotations now, we are in a completely different place, but that it would have been a gradual movement, I suppose. Did that put strains on your relationships with Zionists supporting Jews, perhaps here or in Israel?
My views about Israel and Zionism have changed.
Yeah.
They weren't always as radical as they are now. Now I see very clearly, when I look over the last century, that Zionism is a settler colonial movement.
Yes, you've said that.
And Israel is still a settler colonial movement. And settler colonialism didn't begin in 1967.
Mm-hmm.
It was a continuation of that process. The Jewish American intellectual Noam Chomsky once said that settler colonialism is the most extreme and vicious form of imperialism. Mm-hmm. And the Palestinians have been at the receiving end of, since 1917, of Zionist settler colonialism on the one hand, and Western imperialism on the other hand, first during the British Mandate and since 1948 with America. So now I see very clearly that Israel never wanted to be part of the region. Mm-hmm. And that is why Arabs were justified in seeing Israel as a Western enclave in the Middle East. And if we look at the war in Gaza, which is raging today, it's presented by Israel as a war between Israel and Hamas. Mm-hmm. But I see it in broader historical terms as a war between Israel as a settler colonial state, tied closely to American imperialism, against not just Hamas, but against the Palestinian people altogether, with the aim of preventing the emergence of a Palestinian state.
Would it be fair to say then your transition would have been from, and I say this very loosely, a Zionist to an anti-Zionist?
Yes, but there was a way station on the way.
Absolutely.
I was a Zionist until the time that I finished my military service. Mm-hmm. Then, as a young scholar, I realized that the Zionist movement had achieved its principal aim, which is an independent Jewish state in Palestine, by 1967. Mm-hmm. So on the eve of the Six-Day War, there was a viable Jewish state in Palestine. And for me, this was mission accomplished. And after the war, I wanted Israel to trade land for peace, which is what the UN decreed, that Israel will give back the occupied territories and in return get peace from its Arab neighbors.
Yes.
But Israel chose occupation over peace, and Israel has become addicted to occupation, and Israel today is an apartheid state. There is no question about that. Israel, there was a report by B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, a couple of years ago, and all its previous reports were about Israeli human rights violations in the occupied territories. This time it said you can no longer distinguish between the occupied territories and Israel proper. It's one regime from the river to the sea, and it's an ethnocentric regime. It's a regime in which one ethnic group dominates the other. There is another word for this situation, which is apartheid. So Israel is an aggressive apartheid state, and Israel is a Jewish supremacy state. Israel is officially a racist state because the Jewish nation state law of July 2018, which is a basic law, not an ordinary piece of legislation, but a basic law, it says that the Jewish people have a unique right to self-determination in Israel, which means that no one else has the same right. And the policy guidelines of the present government headed by Benjamin Netanyahu, which has some Jewish fascists in it and real extremists, the policy guidelines say that the Jewish people have an exclusive right to self-determination in the land of Israel, and the land of Israel includes the West Bank as well. So that's why I'm an anti-Zionist, because I believe in equal rights, and I would like a settlement of this conflict. It can be a two-state solution with an independent Palestinian state. That's what I always supported in the past. But Israel has destroyed the two-state solution by building settlements, by annexing East Jerusalem, by building the separation barrier on the West Bank. So the two-state solution no longer exists. And I'm an anti-Zionist, and my solution to the conflict is the only democratic solution. It's one state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, with equal rights for all its citizens, regardless of religion and ethnicity. And the most important thing for me is equality, that there are no different classes of citizens, with Jews having all the rights and privileges and Arabs having none, or degrees of right. Equality is an essential part of democracy, and I would like equality, and this is the best solution in order to achieve both democracy and equality for everybody.
It's very interesting you say that, because I see your face light up. I see almost a longing to bring back that world that your parents lived in. I suppose it's probably a longing to get back to the Baghdad, where in essence it was a Jewish city you speak about so lovingly in your book as well. And this solution, whether it's this solution or the two-state solution, some say even three states, whatever the solution is, the fact that Jews and Arabs, and you are a living testament to that, lived together for centuries as equals, as brothers, or as compatriots, demonstrates that what's going on in the Middle East right now, with the Gaza war, with the incredible loss of life of Palestinians, the horrific attacks that took place in Israel, and the conflict that's taking place within Israel as well, for it to be a solution that perhaps puts a balm on all of that. Is that me being too idealistic? Or is that the only solution that you actually see to take this whole conflict out of the out of history and out of the picture of history once and for all?
You are quite right. My vision for the future has its roots in my experience in the past in Baghdad. And I say this in the book because the book only covers the period until I was finished school at the age of 18. But then there is a long epilogue which traces the evolution of my views on Israel-Palestine until the present, ending with my advocacy of a one-state solution today. But that's all anchored in my own experience in Iraq, because for my family and me, Muslim-Jewish coexistence was not a distant dream. It was the everyday reality. There was nothing remarkable about it. It's nationalism, and it's particularly Zionism, that made Muslim-Jewish coexistence impossible, that divided the region between Israelis and Palestinians, Israelis and Arabs. But I think there is nothing inevitable or preordained or inescapable about Muslim-Jewish antagonism. The driver of our departure from Iraq was not cultural or religious. It was political. It was nationalist forces. And that is why I think that we need to move beyond nationalism, beyond Zionism, towards a better world. And I've said before that I'm proud of my Arab heritage. I'm equally proud of my Jewish heritage. The main pillars of Judaism are truth, justice, and peace. And I look at the present government in Israel and I can't detect any sign of these values. The essence of Judaism is non-violence. And the present Israeli government is the most xenophobic, overtly racist, aggressive, Islamophobic government in Israel's history. And we can see the result of that, the length to which they go to carry out the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And in Gaza, they've gone beyond ethnic cleansing to perpetrating genocide. So I think to move beyond the dismal picture of what the Middle East looks like today, and it's never been more dismal in my experience, we need political imagination, not empty formulas. The two-state solution is just a form of words. It's meaningless. We need political imagination, and my past and the fact that I lived happily in an Arab society enables me to think more imaginatively about the future for our region.
Professor Shlaim, I'm very moved by your words. You come across as somebody who one can only describe as a real humanitarian. To sit with me and to talk about these experiences so vividly, to bring this to our audience about your life and how it shaped you as an individual is something that will stay with me for a very long time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.